Hi, welcome, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on race and the politics of marginality in the Muslim Atlantic. My name is Tamanda Walker, and I am one of the founding members of the Forum on Religion for International Affairs, or FRIA for short. Together with the British Council US office, we've supported the delivery of the British Council's Bridging Voices programme. I'll be facilitating today's webinar, and I'm really delighted to be able to introduce a range of contributors connected with the Muslim Atlantic project. Before we get going and I introduce them, I just want to flag that this is a public event which is being recorded and will be shared online. There will be a Q&A following all of the speakers. However, we do encourage you to submit your questions via the panel chat or the Q&A functionality of Zoom. My colleague is working behind the scenes and will be collating those questions to put to our panelists after they've all spoken. By way of intro, this webinar explores how Muslim communities on both sides of the Atlantic are responding to renewed debates on gender, race, and marginality. It emerges out of a collaborative research project involving King's College London and George Mason University, and is made possible through the British Council's Bridging Voices programme with generous support from Henry Luce Foundation. Today we have a great range of scholars, artists and activists who've contributed to the Muslim Atlantic project over the past few years. They include Dr. Zainab Kabba from the University of Oxford, Dr. Dan DeHanas from King's College London, Dr. Peter Mandaville from George Mason University, Dr. Rasul Miller from the University of California Irvine, Muneera Williams, poet and cultural producer here in the UK, and Abdul-Rehman Malik from Yale University. As you can imagine from this great list of contributors and speakers, it's going to be a tough job for me to do each of them justice in presenting their work and the sheer range of work that they offer. So each of them has kindly agreed that we can drop their links, staff pages and bios into the chat. And I really encourage you to go ahead and look at the work that they're doing and follow up with anybody you would like to after the event. To kick us off, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Zainab Kabba, who's the Associate Director of Programmes and Research at the Scholl Centre for Social Entrepreneurship within Said Business School at the University of Oxford. Zainab has been a critical friend of the project, and we're really pleased to have her here with us today to share some provocations and reflections on the relevance and conceptualization of the project at this particular moment. Welcome, Zainab.
Thanks so much, Tamanda. Thank you, Peter and Daniel, for initially inviting me to be a part of this project. So I'm going to talk a bit about, as Tamanda said, kind of like being a critical friend of the project. So a bit about how I came to be with the group on the project, as well as kind of how things developed over the course of the duration of this great work. So I want to start with kind of a personal reflection and speak to you about that and my relationship to the project in that way. I had yet to be born when I made my first trip across the Atlantic. My half-Jamaican mother was impacted by the Pan-African movement and traveled to West Africa in the 70s for a visit. She would end up staying there for almost a decade in Liberia, marrying a man from Conakry, Guinea, and having 2 children. My father, a jack of all trades businessman, traveled back and forth to New York for their livelihood. When a coup erupted in the 1980s, however, they decided to leave, and I was born in New York a few months later. And settling back into New York, surprisingly, they existed on the periphery of Black Muslim communities, but were firmly placed in Arab and South Asian dominated communities. West African practices in our lives were very much limited to words, phrases, and a few habitual interactions. We retained the notion of self-reliance, a key part of the Pan-Africanist movement, but it moved from more of a collective to the individual. And our Muslim practice was seen through the dominant lens of the time. Thus, I needed to prove I was Muslim, that to non-Black Muslims. A recitation of a surah here, a lesson on my namesake there, and questions from non-Muslims in everyday society, querying what religion I was, despite the fact that I had a traditional headscarf wrapped around my head. How had we gotten here, I thought, given the vastness and multidimensional nature of the Islamic faith? And I embarked thereafter on my own decade-long journey, if you will, studying knowledge creation, the ways in which religious scholars adapt classical narratives, religious narratives to live in the future, and how these scholars present themselves in ways that align with the sacred and profane. In many ways, it seemed that engaging in this project, I really came full circle. When I was approached to advise on the Muslim Atlantic project, I was critical. Gilroy's analytical frame was a powerful one, moving conversations about Blackness from the periphery and constructing a cultural political frame for a myriad of transnational pictures. Was this then going to be a diversity project? Did the Muslim Atlantic really need theorizing? I am the Black Atlantic. Wasn't this sufficient for Black Muslims as well? Was this not muddying the waters, trying to lump everything in together in a way that might dangerously racialize Muslims? And now a UK resident, I had another vantage point. How now would we then, this theoretical approach, contend with the different ways in which race and ethnicity are perceived and dealt with across the Atlantic? What is the best way to contend with the UK's often sole focus on class, recognizing the different strategies for recognizing the best way to contend with class in an attempt to obfuscate the need to talk about race? How would the Muslim Atlantic contend with gender, recognizing the different strategies the government uses to surveillance men and then women as well, with a particular attention to the experiences of Black women grappling with racism, misogyny, and Islamophobia? Would it be able to hold the space for the double standards related to cultural production for men and women? How would it attend to the commodification of Muslims that we now see in the 21st century? While the project wasn't able to capture important elements such as inflections from the African continent and the Caribbean, or attention to the role of capitalist economies, the Muslim Atlantic nonetheless brings forth ideas, embodied practices, people, and all that animates them. I am also the Muslim Atlantic. What I began to see in the Muslim Atlantic was a way to break bonds of the perceived sovereignty of non-Black voice and expression. The Muslim Atlantic allows for another overlay. In asking questions about the geographies that serve as a backdrop to a conversation about Islam or Muslimness, in line with Gilroy, the Muslim Atlantic repositions narratives of Muslimness as a dominant conversation. The idea of the center and the periphery in many ways become irrelevant, recognizing that the framing is simultaneously centripetal as well as centrifugal. Like Gilroy's work, the Muslim Atlantic can attend to the inheritance and experiences of Muslims, both the traumatic ones, very much like Gilroy's work in dealing with slave trade, as well as those that bring joy along this passage. Where the project diverges from Gilroy is also instructive. The absence of predominant exploration of Muslim intellectual writings, moving beyond a sole scholarly frame, allows for an understanding of Muslim practice through the lens of the intellectual as well as the bodily encounters with these ideas. In the end, I'll say that while Gilroy's ship metaphor was useful for its time, one of the provocations I would leave us with is thinking about, in this technological age that we're living in, especially in these pandemic times, it perhaps requires us to re-examine the circulation of ideas, music, garments, people, culture, which define this cultural political space. How will we begin then to reconceptualize this transnational cross-pollination and circulation of goods when travel is no longer the main method for these encounters and often pushes us beyond the Atlantic? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zainab. I found myself nodding vigorously at various points there, including your provocation. I am the Muslim Atlantic. We're now going to switch over to our project PIs, which are Dr. Dan DeHanas, a senior lecturer in political science and religion at King's College London, and Dr. Peter Mandaville, Professor of Government and Politics in the Shah School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Together, they'll share something of the genesis of this project and perhaps also respond to some of the things that Zainab has already raised. Dan, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Zainab, for everything that you offered. And Peter and I promised to speak quite briefly for our section today to make this a multivocal and really engaging conversation. But I think what we want to do just at the beginning is give a bit of a sense of the genesis of the project and particularly Paul Gilroy's ideas in that. Part of that is, absolutely central is Paul Gilroy's work, The Black Atlantic, a book from 1993, which has had an important influence on many different fields. And those who are watching this will likely know that book, but it essentially argued that the collective memory of enslavement was at the heart of constructing a wider sense of Blackness than could be fit into any single geography. And we were interested in understanding if there is an analogous kind of Muslim Atlantic at first in the project. And we sort of thought creatively, tried to bring ideas together, tried to think in terms of different theories, and looked at ways in which there were transatlantic connections between Muslims of many different types. And I think over time, our understanding of the project really evolved so that we recognized that to really work in the spirit of the Black Atlantic, we really had to put Black Muslims absolutely front and center, and that in fact, the Black Atlantic helps us to think about Muslim experience as centrally involving Black Muslim experience in ways which, often those communities and groups of people are marginalized and at the side of understanding who Muslims are in the UK, in the US, and actually in a wider Atlantic space. And so we sort of started naively with a wide range of different things that we wanted to do, and eventually got to thinking more about questions involving gender and race, and we're focusing more on race today. But certainly, as we focus on race today, this way of thinking opened up for us new ways of thinking about questions that both Peter and I have asked about security, for example, about PREVENT and CVE, different programs that are used to surveil Muslims in the US and the UK. And we started to think about how are those programs actually experienced differently by Black Muslims? What kind of history has accumulated which has made that experience really specific and different? And one aspect of that is that in the US, there was an earlier program run by the FBI, COINTELPRO, which was specifically targeting the Nation of Islam, Black Panthers, and other groups. And as Black Muslims in the US face security measures, there are strong echoes, if not direct links and ties to the methods and tactics that were used by this earlier program, which gives a different resonance and a different sense of what that means. So that's just a picture of one of the types of questions which I think is opened up quite a bit differently by thinking about the Black aspects of Muslim experience in an Atlantic frame. I think the other main thing that I would say that we learned from this project is that while we enjoy trying to think about this and we find it really exciting and engaging, it's absolutely the case that this project has been about bringing many voices into conversation. And actually the best things that we've done have been to be able to draw scholars and activists and artists over to London a couple of different times to talk about these issues. The British Council and Luce were very generous in allowing us to do that kind of thing through Bridging Voices. But also we were able to curate an issue of Critical Muslim, a Muslim literary journal, which brought together more than a dozen voices, some of whom are represented here, and included poetry and an excerpt from a play, as well as different essays and photography and other aspects as well. So the project's become much wider than anything that we could accomplish as a small project team. And I think hopefully we'll set into motion a lot more thinking beyond our small abilities and skills. But we do hope that you'll be interested to hear more from other people who've contributed to the project or been part of those conversations in the next few minutes.
Great, thanks very much, Dan, and thank you, Zainab, for opening us up this morning, this afternoon, for those of you time zones further east, and Tamanda, thank you for guiding us through our session today. Dan, I think, really nicely covered some of the key reflections that we've had on the project's origins and genesis. So I'll speak very briefly. He mentioned the special issue of Critical Muslim. If you look in the chat window, we've just thrown up a link to that. So all of the content is actually available online, open access, so you can peruse those contributions at your leisure. I think the couple of points that I wanted to add by way of reflection on the evolution of our work is to kind of reiterate what Dan said about the project kind of starting one place and ending somewhere else. At the very beginning, it looked much more like a conventional research project. There are going to be interviews and focus groups and something like research findings. But I think that as the centrality of race and gender and security kind of emerged as the organizing thematics of the project, and as the project developed during a period in which, in both the US and the UK, we witnessed a number of political developments around rising tides of populist nationalism, which had very particular impact on the communities that we were studying in the project. We kind of realized that the original plan kind of had to be put aside to kind of allow the project to kind of come to fruition and realize itself in the context of very current events going on. I think things happening more particularly in the United States this year, I think just throws that point into relief even further. I think as the project took on these specific areas of foci, I think it's also fair to say that, you know, Dan and I came to be increasingly conscious of the limitations of what we were doing and our ability to fully, you know, explore these themes by dint of the fact that this was increasingly a project about race and gender in the Muslim Atlantic being directed by two white male non-Muslim Americans. And so it's been vitally important, I think, for us to have the input and the support and to allow the project and its parameters to be defined by those who, you know, are and embody aspects of what we've termed the Muslim Atlantic. I think also we kind of realized that we would be able to learn much more from the project and to kind of bring more to the world from it by moving out of a conventional scholarly research apparatus and paradigm and be more cognizant of the extent to which the realms of, for example, cultural production and the arts are and continue to be central to the development and articulation of some of these themes and ideas. And so I think one of the aspects of the project that I appreciated most, and you know, which one of our contributors, Abdul-Rehman Malik, who you'll hear from later, has really been central in helping to support, is allowing us to kind of reach beyond the confines of the academy and, you know, what might be conventionally understood to be research subjects, to involve a much wider range of artists, cultural producers, activists, sharing their insights and perspectives alongside more conventional scholarly contributions to reveal different aspects of this space that we're calling the Muslim Atlantic. And so, you know, the rest of our program today is really going to be dedicated to allowing some of those voices and their perspectives and ideas to come out. So I think I'll leave it at that. And thank you all again for being with us today. Thanks, Tamanda.
Thank you so much, Dan and Peter, for your reflections there on the project. I'd like to introduce one of the contributors to the panels that were already referred to earlier in the year, who I had the great pleasure of listening to at the time. And that is Dr. Rasul Miller, who's Assistant Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine. We're really pleased to have Rasul here to share his insights and, frankly, his stellar intellectual engagement with issues of Black communal self-organizing, looking specifically at Black radical international perspectives from Malcolm X to the present. Thank you, Rasul.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you. Bismillah, Muhammad. So I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. It was such an honor and a privilege to be a part of the conference, you know, in the UK. I think, yeah, they put my info in the bio, and my information isn't up on the University of California Irvine website yet. So this is an old link, but hopefully, you know, you'll be able to see my my info at my current institution soon. But yeah, but I think just to sort of frame my comments, one of the things that I think is really sort of important for me in thinking about this whole notion of a Muslim Atlantic is the way in which Islam in America, at least, has in many ways been the outgrowth of Black American Muslims and Muslims really in the sort of Western part of the Atlantic world in general, trying to sort of reconnect with understand the significance of Islam's relationship to the people of African descent, the transatlantic slave trade. In the piece that I really gave as an address that was adapted for Critical Muslim, of course, we talked about Malcolm. Malcolm, I think, becomes a very important sort of touchstone for people in thinking about this. But really, Malcolm's rise to prominence is the outgrowth of an older history of African American Orthodox Muslim movements, Muslim communities, as well as the Moorish Science Temple, folks who are organizing in the Garvey movement who are interested in Islam, all of which, all of these communities are heavily surveilled. Dan mentioned the history of COINTELPRO, which I think is very appropriate to invoke as a sort of precursor to CVE. And really, J. Edgar Hoover, who is really the architect of COINTELPRO, really cuts his teeth surveilling and sending people to infiltrate the Garvey movement, right? And then the Moorish Science Temple, and then the Nation of Islam. So something that is really interesting about this sort of moment that Malcolm rises to prominence is it's often sort of imagined to be the beginning of Islam being an important part of sort of the religious experience and political imagination of folks in the West in the 20th century, at least. And my work really tries to demonstrate that's not really the case. But Malcolm does represent this sort of tipping point where a couple of things happen. One, this awareness of the importance of Islam in that transnational encounter, or that transatlantic encounter, as well as the sort of internationalism that Malcolm represents, really sort of emerges on the popular scene in a new kind of way. We could talk about a long history of Black internationalism and Black radicalism, but Malcolm really represents an important sort of node in that chain. But then also there's an interesting conversation happening between folks in the Nation of Islam and folks who are embracing more orthodox iterations of Islam. And that is the sort of tension, if you will, between or around the idea of internationalism, right? So for certain folks who are identifying with Islam in that moment, right, the 1950s and 1960s moment, people are really concerned with sort of breaking free of the limitations of the geographical limitations of the American nation state. And that begins to manifest during the 1970s and 80s as folks are able to travel more, folks are learning languages. I was really, sort of moved by Zainab's provocation and her own telling of her own experience. This kind of international exchange across the Atlantic becomes part and parcel to the experience of a lot of Muslim communities that are emerging, Black Muslim communities that are emerging in the West at the time. But the sort of tension between that and the sort of imperative of establishing Black nationalist oriented communities, and I think a more appropriate way to talk about that would be communities that are really concerned with Black political economy in the US. This is a tension that Malcolm sort of is able to hold, right? So you have folks in Nation of Islam in this moment becomes the largest and in many ways most impactful iteration of Islam in the States. And so you have this moment where, radicalism, internationalism, Islam, and Black political economy, the importance of establishing a sort of nexus of political economic power that's independent of the nation state for Black people, all sort of is all sort of connected, right? And in many ways, I think that for me, one of the reasons why I find this framing of a Muslim Atlantic really, really fruitful, and one of the questions that I'm really interested in is how do we sort of mine that history for sort of viable ways of resisting the nation state and various forms of repression today. And as I close, just to give a sort of quick example, for instance, during the 1960s and the 1970s, when the Nation of Islam is at its height, and you have organizations like the Dar al-Islam movement, which at that time is the largest collective of African-American Sunni Muslim or Orthodox Muslim congregations in America, and the rise of the Black Panther Party, which on the East Coast is, attracts a large number of Muslim organizers as well. One of the hallmarks of these groups is the idea of armed self-defense, right? Armed self-defense, community policing, things like that, things that are really difficult to organize around in this current, sort of repressed political moment. So as power is global and as nation states, the sort of apparatus of nation state repression and surveillance is global, my sort of question or provocation that I end on is, how can we sort of revamp this history of, sort of resistance to the nation state in a way that is similarly global, right? In a way that connects communities in different geographical places, in a way that connects communities across the Atlantic on the ground, so that we can have a sort of bottom-up internationalism, right? That can be used to sort of combat, the kind of global systems of repression that are really embodied by the nation state. So I'll end on that, and really interested to hear the thoughts and provocations from these other wonderful panelists who are my dear friends and teachers as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Rasul. And I'll move straight over to the next panelist, which is the fabulous Muneera Williams. So Muneera Williams is a poet and cultural producer, as I've already said, and an artist and an activist and she's here to share her intellectual and creative contributions around race, politics and place with reference to BLM. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be here and to be a part of this. It's interesting because, as a poet and a creative who hasn't really learned how to rein myself in, when I was told I had 5 minutes, I was like, where do I go? What do I start to think about, talk about, or write about? And so I guess, gathered many different thoughts about growing up and really about my life and where I am currently. And I would say that after 17 years, I reluctantly moved back to Bristol. I moved from Bristol to London when I was a kid, and I recently moved back. When I was young and I moved to London, I'm not sure if I even knew what I was running away from. I was definitely running away from something. There were no examples of people going to study in my immediate family, nor in my friendship groups. Neither was there any expectation for me to study. And I was not even really concerned with going to university. I was definitely running away from something. In fact, I'll go as far to say that I didn't go to university to study. I went to university to sort of escape. I was looking for an escape route, or a way out. And I know that sounds very dramatic. I'm aware of that. But I mean, I grew up in an average working class household in England, I had both parents present. I had more than many people that I knew, yet there was something about my body in Bristol that felt uncomfortable. It felt suffocated. There was something about living in the confines of Bristol that left me feeling squashed into spaces that didn't fit me. And I would squeeze myself, and rarely when I did squeeze myself into these spaces, I rarely felt welcomed. And in the times that I did feel welcome, I definitely didn't feel valued. In fact, it felt like I should be appreciative of being in these spaces. I didn't know the language to express my thoughts, both when I was a kid and when I first moved to London. I didn't know the theories to challenge why I felt like that. So I left Bristol in search of a sense of belonging, searching for some place to call home. Out there, I thought there was a place that was home, and I had a tribe of people. All I had to do was try to find them. Surely it was me in Bristol. I had not tried hard enough. I had not met my people. There was something that I was doing wrong. I don't know if I found my tribe in moving to London, but I definitely found people who, I guess I could say, I found myself reflected in their hearts and in their experiences. Black people, brown people, indigenous people, people of faith, Muslim people, people of no faiths, people from, all different backgrounds, from different countries, Black women particularly, people who felt squished and squashed into these various different boxes. I think in this journey of seeking belonging and looking for a place to belong, what became clear is that actually it wasn't because of me. It wasn't because of these people why we didn't feel like we belonged. It was something about the system in which we were living in. It was something about the society in which we were living in that told us that we were inadequate, that we didn't feel, that we should be appreciative of being wherever we were, that there was a reason why we didn't belong. There was something about me as a young Black girl which you know, looking at the images of Black girls that were around me, or looking at the experiences of Black girls around me, like found themselves in various things like criminality, found themselves in abusive situations. I was told by the narrative of which I grew up in that we had a propensity towards this. It's only when I moved to London and I started, you know, hanging out with different people, listening to different music, that I realized that society had told us this. And part of this was based on simply the way that society established itself within the world. It was based on, it was almost like a justification for society to say, yeah, we can treat people differently. Some people belong and some people don't belong. That's just the way how it is. I think moving into this sort of like COVID-19 period, you know, or being in this COVID-19 space, like there's a certain amount of social solidarity that we've managed to find. It's not the great like leveler, the grand leveler that people have been speaking about, but there's a certain amount of social solidarity. People are now starting to ask questions about the world that we're living in. Why are there systems that at the end of the day really just marginalize people, push people to the edge of society? Why are there systems that make people feel like they don't belong, that lead to people being imprisoned, which lead to people getting a second class, third or fourth class education, or no education whatsoever? What I've learned from this particular project is that all around the world, there are people like me. Across the ocean, there are people like me who are finding ways to resist the narratives that we have been told. Narratives that have been told to us to simply justify greed, to justify having more than what we need, to justify, you know, exploitation of particular people, you know, to justify so many of the things that we're seeing, so many of the things that have been exposed as a result of this COVID-19. I know that I belong to a legacy of resistance. I know that I belong to a tribe of people who will challenge and who will look for new ways to challenge people, who will look for new ways to challenge government, who have always challenged government, who have challenged occupiers, who have challenged, you know, colonialists. And I'm very proud to be a part of that heritage. And that's what really drew me to this. And I'm a poet, I'm a creative. So academia isn't really my thing, but being in a gathering like this and being inspired to think about ways that I can express my creativity, so that this isn't just something that a few people have access to. This is something that everybody has access to, so that as communities, we could come together and look at this society, look at the system that we're living in, and that we can have hope of something better. We can know that actually this is by design. The things that we don't like about the society is by design, and we have the power, we have the intellect, we have the creativity to be able to make change. We have the community to make change. And that's just me. And I just want to say thank you so much for allowing me to be here. And even though I reluctantly moved back to Bristol, I am now very proud of Bristol, as we are having conversations, have set the stage for conversations all around the globe about statues, about memorials, about who's remembered and how people are remembered, and actually how we can reframe this. And I believe that the Muslim Atlantic is reframing the way that we think about faith, reframing the way that we think about race and its relationship.
Thank you so much, Muneera. It's such a pleasure always to hear you speak. And there's so much richness in what you've shared as well. So I'm very grateful that we have, last but by no means least, Abdul-Rehman Malik, a journalist, educator, and cultural organizer, as well as a lecturer and associate research scholar at Yale Divinity School, to share reflections on what other panelists have shared so far, and really what it means to conceptualize the Muslim Atlantic at the present time. Abdul-Rehman, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tamanda, and I hope everyone can hear me all right. Just first of all to say that it's been a real pleasure to be part of this project and the thinking around this project over the last 2 years. It's been a pleasure to work with my old friend and teacher, Peter Mandaville, with Dan, but particularly with you know, an incredible group of interlocutors, scholars, activists, thinkers, people like Muneera and Rasul and Zainab and others who have come into this space from a genealogy of understanding and engaging with folks like Gilroy, but also others, but also entering into this kind of discursive conversation by thinking about what are the possibilities that people like Gilroy and Gilroy's ideas of the Black Atlantic are not static. And in fact, by proposing the notion of the Muslim Atlantic, what we're actually, what I felt we were actually saying and doing was saying that how do ideas around the space of exchange, thought, action, economy, politics, spirituality, how does this space of engagement and interaction develop? And how can we continue to provide frames and lenses through which we can see the complexity and the vibrancy of what is happening in these spaces? And I think that's what drew me to the project initially. And so much like Zainab said, and as Zainab really began this conversation today with, I think really the most appropriate provocation that she centers herself not merely as an observer of the Muslim Atlantic, not merely as a theorizer of the Muslim Atlantic, but as the Muslim Atlantic, embodied it. And I would take that one step further and say, to what extent have those of us who self-identify as Muslim and who have been shaped by this space of exchange and travel and ideas and spirituality and politics and economy, to what extent do we embody the Muslim Atlantic? And I think we do so in so many ways. I remember when the project started, it actually wasn't entirely clear right away that the conversations that we were initially having were going to center around Blackness. Of course, Gilroy was there, but there was also an interest in seeing what other kinds of conversations and exchanges were happening. And I think quite appropriately, as we got stuck into the weeds of the work, we continue to recognize that part of the problem in a lot of Muslim discourse is the fact that Blackness and the experience of transatlantic chattel slavery, and the fact that in so many ways North American, South American, Caribbean Islam Black Islam is often erased and forgotten. It's erased and forgotten in a lot of mainstream Muslim discourses. That may not seem like the case over the last few months, where the aftermath of the uprisings following Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd's murder, we've seen a kind of an appropriate eruption into a lot of spaces of Black Muslim voices. And not that those voices weren't there before, but I think in many ways some of those voices were ignored. And I think that is a systemic problem. That is an institutional problem within sort of the body of Islam, or the body of the Ummah. So I think the arrival to this point where we are centering this experience and these narratives is really important. And I think in many ways this is also a moment then for us to think about where the discussion and the project goes from here. We could simply end it at this point and see where it goes. But I just don't think that that's possible. I also think that whether an academic project begins or ends, that project doesn't shape the landscape. The landscape of the Muslim Atlantic is a live landscape. And in my piece in Critical Muslim, what I tried to kind of push for and to center is that, in fact, what we are seeing when we look through this kind of lens of the Muslim Atlantic is really, we're looking at a Muslim cultural ecosystem. We are seeing a space of exchange. And I want to be sure that we're not just centering a UK-US, as I think we did in many ways at the beginning of the project, I think where there has been a course correction. But actually to think about this space as a North America, South America, Caribbean space, to think about this as an Africa, West Africa, South Africa, North Africa space, to think about not just the UK, but to think about Europe. And through the processes of colonization and the decolonial movements and post-colonial realities, we even go farther afield than that. The fact that my father traveled from Pakistan to Britain, to North America, is part also of the story of the Muslim Atlantic, and what influences he is picking up on the way. In my article, I talk about the case of the incredible and wonderful Imru Bukhari, filmmaker, scholar of African film, who describes the kind of pregnant, potent scene in Portobello Road in the late 1970s and 80s, where Black Afro-Caribbean filmmakers and cultural producers are sitting with African legends like Usman Sembene and others, and literally creating new cultural forms, new ideas, bringing in existing political and cultural movements, hacking them, creating around them. So I think what I would like to see us do as we go forward is to really think about cultural leadership. Who are those people who are shaping culture? Cultural change precedes political change, if we are to believe Jeff Chang, and I do in this case. Cultural change does precede political change. And I think for too long, we've centered religious leadership, political leadership, economic leadership over the fact that cultural leadership, that is the place where politics, economics, and spirituality get real. That's where they get parsed out. That's where they get analyzed. That's where they get spit out. That's where they get reconfigured. That's where they synthesize. That's where we see the fault lines. So it's seeing this space as a cultural ecosystem. And the work, I think, as we go forward, needs to be around understanding this cultural ecosystem, not just mapping it, but understanding what motivates cultural actors within the system. How are they not really sharing ideas? This is not an exchange of ideas. This is a synergy of ideas. This is a battle of ideas. When Dr. Rasul Miller speaks about Black radicalism after Malcolm X, or Sohail Dolatzai speaks about the Muslim International, Muneera Williams speaks about her Caribbean British reality, which is now deeply linked to her experiences in West Africa and the Sudan. Or Zainab speaks about her own histories of being multiculturally Black. What actually we're seeing here is not merely exchange, but is creation. We are creating culture. We are creating the space. And that space, and this is my last point, is that space is not merely limited to a Black experience or a Muslim experience. That creation has wide-ranging implications on all kinds of cultures. That in our own cultural ecosystems, those cultural ecosystems overlap and influence broader cultural, political, economic, and spiritual conversations. So as Peter rightfully said, I think as we end this part of the project and begin to think about other work that can be done, my excitement is really about that work, and also continuing to recognize our own, not only our own biases, but our own institutional barriers to understanding the fullness of what this space, of what the Muslim Atlantic space within the broader Black Atlantic space gives us. And that simply means that there will need to be more voices, and there will need to be more scholarship. And we will have to center outside the academy to really the scholars of culture and the street, from where we're going to get the temperature of the now, rather than something that's stale and ossified and studied.
Right, thank you so much, Abdul-Rehman. You're right, we will need more voices, and new voices that aren't currently part of the conversation. We're now opening up for our Q&A. We have just about 10 minutes, so it's going to be tough to get to hear from everyone, but we have one question already, and while this is being answered, please do feel free to submit more questions via the chat. We really welcome them. The first question here is one from Josh Catt, and it feels like an incredibly timely conversation. He's saying, I was wondering two things. To what extent did stakeholders and partners in the project feel that policy professionals felt able to engage with the issues which emerged out of this project? And secondly, what might a policy conversation look like that is more literate and aware of the nuances discussed here? I think we'll give that to Peter to start with.
Sure, thanks, Tamanda, and thanks, Josh, for the question. I'm happy to take an initial stab at it, but I really hope it's one that others, that other panelists will weigh in on. I mean, I think Dan and I realized very early on that this was never going to be the kind of research project that kind of generates conventional scholarly findings around which you could make something like policy recommendations. And I also think that the sorts of conversations, perspectives, and experiences that began to emerge as the core of the project are also ones that were, while certainly generated by and reflective of structural dimensions of society that have been generated by histories of policies, were conversations that policy professionals, I think, would have difficulty in engaging with, because I think they point to some fundamental long-running and ongoing structural contradictions in society. So if I have to kind of reach towards and grasp for something like the policy import of the work we've done, I think it would be to say that it is work that suggests that the ways in which the kind of conventional policy categories that are used around issues like Muslims and Blackness and gender need to really be rethought and reframed, right? Because if we're talking about a kind of environment in which in North America, Muslimness is understood primarily in relation to security, and in the UK, Muslimness is understood primarily in relation to immigration and integration, then I think what the project has helped to reveal, and what ongoing events help to show, is that Blackness, Muslimness, gender, and security are all deeply wrapped up in a set of fundamental structural contradictions that generate various forms of inequality in societies, both on, on either side of the Atlantic. And so I think what the project has done is to kind of show the ways in which those histories, we're talking centuries here, of structural contradiction and structural aspects of society that in many ways are fundamentally at odds with conventional narratives that have emerged in American and UK society and British society about the stories those countries tell about themselves. That the sort of reckoning that we're starting to have about these issues call for, I think, quite wide-sweeping, fundamental structural reforms that would have to take place in a space that we conventionally demarcate as policy. I just don't know whether and to what extent politics, as distinct from policy in either the UK or the United States right now, is at a point of being able to actually come to terms with and be cognizant of the extent of the sort of structural revolution that would need to take place to begin to have an impact on these issues. So I'll leave it at that.
Perfect, thank you, Peter. And I think this would be a good point perhaps to go to Abdul-Rehman based on his previous experience in this area as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, and I'd love to also kind of butt this over to Rasul after this short intervention. I agree with Peter. I think what Peter has defined is there are so many structural issues, and so many structural issues around really understanding not only the terrain but who we are talking about. And I think what this project certainly suggests to me, and the kind of interventions that we've had suggest to me, is that actually where this becomes policy relevant is actually in the need for a policy revolution, under a real re-understanding of the communities and peoples that these policies are not only addressing, but how they address them in the first place. In the UK, and for my sins, I since 2005 was deeply engaged in this space, which was sort of proto-Prevent and CVE, and with fellow warrior Peter Mandaville have been in many kind of pitched battles on what this means over the years. But one thing I do know is that the fact is that the fight has constantly been to see how do we understand communities. And in fact, there has been a willful attempt within policy circles, I would say this now, to kind of separate Muslimness from things like Blackness, to separate Muslimness from the experience of things like COINTELPRO. And when activists and others have sought to do that, it has been used as a way to put the label of extremism or radicalization against those who oppose those kind of policy frames. And I think in some ways what this Muslim Atlantic conversation at least is starting to give us a kind of a discursive language for is to suggest something that we've all already known, whether that's scholars, activists, researchers, but maybe it's giving us a slightly better language to say that these are not separate things but overlapping realities. And I know people like Rasul have looked at post-Malcolm formulations of Black and Muslim activism, and maybe there's something here, Rasul, that you could add based on that historic experience.
For sure. I'm sorry. Muhammad, my little guy, my son just woke up, so I managed him during the call. But yeah, no, absolutely. And what, I think what's even more pertinent for me is something that you said, Abdul-Rehman, during your initial comments about how, really the answer to a lot of these issues is going to come from looking at culture rather than, policy. And, similar to, yes, that hand, similar to even Peter, as you mentioned, I think one of the reasons why I think I'm so interested in, issues of political economy from a grassroots sort of non-nation state space is this understanding in this sort of Black radical discourse that, to quote one sort of quippy comment from a scholar I once heard, liberalism is not going to liberate us, right? It really is going to take a kind of, bottom-up approach where people are empowered in different kinds of ways. And I didn't really talk about this in my piece, but even just in my own experience, traveling to West Africa, just because I'm Muslim, right? And just because, my dad, as a sort of product of this Pan-African Muslim moment, traveling to West Africa, taking me there, I think one of the things that I discovered that struck me so much was the way in which folks on that side of the water organized in the wake of colonization and Western imperialism to be able to create these, semi-autonomous spaces. I'm of course talking about, these cities like Medina Bay and Touba that I encountered in Senegal. And for me, it was this aha moment, like, this is what we've been trying to, create in Harlem and in Philadelphia and in Atlanta, The croissant is open? Okay. Well, we'll eat the croissants. Yeah, and I think that, for one of the and I think it's a great question. One of the things, and I'll end on this, one of the things that really struck me during the conference was the fact that I saw people who engaged in different kinds of policy work, different kinds of organizing, doing great work that I think is important and I think we need to support. And I do think it's a worthwhile endeavor to figure out how sort of more literate understanding of all of these things we're talking about can result in better policy. But on some level, I think what we're witnessing in this moment is this sort of, collective realization that, the nation state, that policy is so limited that perhaps what we really need are non-nation state actors, people outside of the academy even, who have the power to sort of galvanize people to realize their own potential, to organize for their own liberation, right? To really cultivate a kind of independence and self-determination that we haven't really seen for maybe the last 4 or 5, maybe the last 3 or 4 decades because of COINTELPRO, right? Because the nation state has become so astute in figuring out how to sort of disempower people and create a sort of monopoly on things like force and on things like policing. So I'll stop there. And I want to maybe, to borrow Abdul-Rehman's words, kind of bunt over to Dan and hear what his thoughts on this are.
Fantastic. Thanks for all those thoughts. Just to add one thing on Josh's question about policy ideas, the closest that we got to writing something about that is in our second report, and I think we could put the link out for that report. We had 5 suggestions, and those often had something to do with policy, and those involved things like building more trust, essentially, to enable policy to really work, and pulling out all the surveillance from programs which have tried to fund different groups before, really considering and understanding intersectionality and really getting engaged in programs that think about that and actually fund intersectional projects, et cetera, et cetera. So take a look at that if you get a chance. I also see that there's another question, and I may be taking Tamanda's role by reading out a question here just due to time, but I see a question from Fatou Simbe. I know the project is more about the links between the UK and the Americas, but has there been any interest or participation or contribution from other European regions like France or Germany? And I mean, that is an excellent question, and that is the direction in which we have been heading. We're definitely much more attuned, as Abdul-Rehman said, to the wider links to the Caribbean, the colonial histories that go beyond the Anglosphere to some of these other French colonial powers in Africa and other places. So we're very interested in that, and essentially we hope that this motivates people to do that work, or that this work can continue in different forms beyond what we're doing as well. But it's very resonant with the type of work we would be trying to do and the perspective we try to bring across.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you for taking that question as well. There was also one from Michael Feldman about Global South and including them, which I presume from my involvement in the project is a similar answer. That is the hope and desire going forward. We are short of, and in fact almost out of time, but I do want to just take an opportunity to allow both Zainab and Muneera to comment on anything that they've heard so far, particularly around future directions for the project, and perhaps also this issue of policy. So Zainab, I'll come to you quickly. I know you may have a hard stop, so if people do need to leave, hopefully you can catch the last bits on the recording before we close out.
Great, thanks so much, Tamanda, and thanks for all those remarks, Rasul, Peter, and Abdul-Rehman. I think one thing I would say is just in kind of thinking about going forward and where some of the attention might want to be placed is really around this idea of language and the rhetoric. So, you know, oftentimes, and I think this has very much related to what Peter was talking about and kind of the policy and politics of it all, that, you know, when we even speak and engage in conversations about Muslims, we often separate them from Blackness. So we say Muslims and Black communities, immediately creating this kind of separation between the two, which often, again, just leads to this kind of erasure of Black Muslims within the overall Muslim community. So I think that is quite an important thing to focus on, particularly given kind of the time period that we are in. I think the second thing I would say is really around this the narratives of, you know, who we are and who we taking ourselves to be at this current time in this moment. I think, you know, and I'll bunt it over to Muneera right after this to follow up perhaps with some comments on it. But I think, you know, her highlighting, as we all see, what COVID has revealed, the level of even anti-Blackness within Muslim communities, particularly that has been laid bare by COVID, at times and in certain places, creating some degree of inertia within Muslim communities to not even know how to respond in this way, given this idea of sort of separation between race. So I think this conversation particularly is apt for this UK-US lens, given the way in which what is happening with the racial pandemic, if you will, is being actualized across the Atlantic in this way. And there seems to be a lot of this mirroring across the Atlantic. And I think Muneera is probably very poignant person to talk about that, particularly given her experience with the work in Bristol and the work that she's been doing in London.
Yeah, I was just thinking about a poem. I'm not going to read the whole poem. It was a poem by Vanessa Kasule. She's an artist who's based in Bristol, a poet who's based in Bristol. And she talked about, or she wrote a poem essentially about the Colston statue coming down. And the opening lines are sort of, you came down easy in the end. The righteous wrench of 2 ropes in a grand pile. Briefly, you flew, corkscrewed, then met the ground with a clang of toy guns, loose chains, and a rain of cheers. And she goes on to talk about, the poem's called Hollow. She goes on to talk about how easily the statue came down. We thought it was something that was so grand, something that would stand the test of time, but actually the statue was just hollow. And I think it's really important to have conversations like this and to continue these conversations and, you know, having these cross-discipline sort of platforms where we can get all of our ideas out. Because actually, I think we are in a new time where we're starting to realize that the models of system, the models of governance, of rule, they are hollow. They may seem grand, they may seem glitzy, they may seem gold, but actually we have the possibility and the opportunity to be able to tear them down. And I think we just need to really focus on that to be able to move on to the next phase of what we call this modern world.
Thank you so much. What a note to end on. It's been great having all of our panelists and speakers. So thank you so much to all of you. Dan, Peter, Zainab, Rasul, Muneera, Abdul-Rehman. It's a pleasure to hear you speak, and I really wish we had more time so we could have more of the questions that are coming through. And of course, thank you to all of those of you who have joined us and who have submitted your questions today. As a reminder to all of you, you'll shortly be receiving an email in your inbox, and that will include a link to the final research project, Living the Muslim Atlantic, Race, Gender and the Politics of Marginality, which is by Dan, Peter and Renasha Khan. In addition to that, there will be a link to the special issue, if you haven't had it enough through the chat, on the Muslim Atlantic, which includes some great contributions from all of the speakers that from most of the speakers that you've heard today. Also in that email, you will find a link to a very, very short survey, which is used by the British Council to evaluate the project and today's webinar. It is anonymous. It's only going to be used to independently assess the programming, but we would be extremely grateful for a few minutes of your time to complete that. Finally, thanks goes to the British Council and also Henry Luce Foundation for supporting this really important research and project, which is very timely. We really hope you've enjoyed today as much as we have, and thank you again for joining us. Wishing you a wonderful day ahead, whichever side of the Atlantic you're on, and probably a very hot one. Do take care.